Thank you so much for tuning in this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where in the world you are. I really am glad that you are here. Like Al mentioned, my name is Thomas Igeme. I head up People Manager Development at ServiceNow. I also sit on the board for Tribe.ai, which is a people analytics tool in the learning and development space, which is my deep connection to the PAFOW community. And I am deeply, deeply passionate about the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion, leadership development, and people analytics. And hopefully through a couple of minutes that we have today, I'll be able to kind of share some of why that is and get some of you excited about it as well. But I just do want to contextualize the context in which we are having this conversation. We are having a global reckoning around race that has put diversity, equity, and inclusion squarely on the corporate agenda in 2020. You can't seem to throw a stone or click through your news feed without some other, I think, much needed conversation about how important this topic is and how far behind we are on it. But I often think that what can get lost in the midst of all of this is the deeply personal stories behind why this is. And so I actually thought I would use some of our time to share a bit about my personal connection to this topic and why this matters so much to me. So this is a photo of the community right next to where I grew up. While I live in the United States now, I was actually born and raised in Kenya. And I grew up very poor in Kenya. And that will be important in terms of why this issue is so important to me. But I came to the US at 18, like many immigrants to this country, searching for a better life for me and for my family back home. When I came to this country with exactly $273 to my name, that amount of money went a lot further back where I was from than it did here. For me, professional success and professional opportunity was as much about survival, both mine and my family's back home, as it was about self-actualization. Now, I was really fortunate. I got a diversity scholarship that was put up by somebody right here in the business world who cared about creating a more equitable future. And that gave me the opportunity to go to college, without which I would never have had tertiary education. And that really was the opportunity that began to shift things, not just for me, but for my family. So I was supporting my family back home since the age of 20. Both of my sisters eventually came over to the States for their university education, one of whom is a doctor right now here in the US, fighting on the front lines of COVID. The other is a diversity and inclusion management consultant. And I share that one because I'm often really proud of my family, but because for me, they're daily reminders of the stories that we're talking about when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and giving everyone a fair shot at professional success. I should never have been here in front of you today. The statistics didn't predict it. The chances that people around me had would never have allowed it. And it is only because a few people took diversity, equity, and inclusion seriously. And that is what I think is the opportunity in front of us right now. What could happen if so many more of us gave opportunities to people like me? And what is the world that we could build together? And so really, that's what I've built my career around. How do we make sure that work and our professional lives are a place where anyone can truly have a fair shot at professional success? And I've done that in lots of different iterations. But as I've really pursued diversity, equity, and inclusion and the best ways to make it happen, I've become obsessed with leadership development and people analytics as what I now see as the two other legs of the stool, that the first, of course, being diversity and inclusion, that are required to truly create equity. I firmly believe that unless we can leverage leadership development to change behavior and people analytics to quantify meaningful change, as well as set direction on where we go, well, all that we're just left doing is talking, right? And the reason I think that's so important is if we look back on what we've been doing for the last 20 years or so, isn't that really what we've been doing on this topic? Just talking. We've invested, we've built a 60 billion plus a year annual global industry on diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what do we really have to show for it? I'm not going to bore you with all the statistics that probably many of you have looked at time and time again this year, but it's basically we are no different in any marginal way than we were coming into the 90s. And for that kind of investment, we simply must do better. Now, I know I realize the irony of me talking about the limitations of just speaking as I speak at a conference, but please don't get me wrong. Talking is important. It is how we build awareness. The big message is it can't just be all we do, right? Unless that awareness turns into personal behavior change and then systemic policy and organizational change as well, we're not going to do much. And so really that has been the question that I am deeply obsessed with, is how do you get personal behavior change and systemic policy change around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And the reason that that's so happened is I'll start with a counterfactual, which is what happens when you don't have people analytics involved as you're trying to go after it. My favorite anti-example of this is unconscious bias training. I'm sure many of you at this point have heard of that. It's a very popular solution to address diversity, equity, and inclusion. Unconscious bias training is absolutely a critical part of the journey, but there is an increasing amount of science that shows that it can actually be a really harmful place to start. The reason that's so dangerous for us is up until about a year ago, the number one place that any corporation went when they had when they recognized the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion was specifically into unconscious bias training. And it really wasn't until a series of studies from the world of people analytics, talk about people analytics for good, my favorite of which was by Adam Grant, Angela Duckworth, and Katie Milkman that came out about 2 years ago, that actually scientifically studied the impact on change and behavior from folks who'd been through unconscious bias training versus the control. And what we found was really sad, that there was basically nothing. And in fact, there's some other anecdotal studies that show that there might actually be a small negative effect to inclusion. And that for me is the most kind of intrinsic example of the value of people analytics in this work. We are all trying to figure out where we should go. And unless we have the right data to understand both what the impact of what we're doing is and how the different alternatives in front of us shape up, we unfortunately are wasting money at a time that we really can't afford to. And so with that kind of in mind, what does the world of people analytics tell us about what we could do in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion? My favorite kind of model for this is something that is sometimes called the 2 sigma problem. And what that simply is that when people have models of learning and models of behavior change that are really based off of where learning kind of started with prior to the Industrial Revolution, with deep personal tutors who understood their exact unique needs and were able to customize what they threw at them based on those and then track progress, well, we see a 2 sigma or 2 standard deviation value in the amount of learning and change in behavior versus the norm. The challenge with, of course, with that is that doesn't scale. And so what is being defined as the 2 sigma problem is a question of, well, how do we get effective learning that beautifully scales? And I think the answer to that question lies in people analytics. And in a moment, I'll share with you some really cool stories about where I've seen that. But if you think about the role of a tutor, giving you a clear sense of exactly where you are on the journey, pointing you and quantifying what that difference is, showing you the impact of those changes as you go through. Those are all really difficult things for us to scale with humans, but really potentially powerful things for us to scale as we think about combining people analytics with artificial intelligence to put that in people's hands. And really, that's been the exciting question that I've been diving around, which is how do we get really clear on what the impact is? But I think there's actually a potential to take that to the next level. And what I mean by that is actually putting analytics into the hands of the learners. So very often when we think about people analytics, we think about the talent analytics team, we think about the HR organization, and absolutely that is critical in order for us to move. But when we think about behavior change on anything, but especially something as deeply personal as diversity, equity, and inclusion, very often the people who we need to make changes are the individual, right? The individual employee on the floor. It's one thing for the diversity, equity, and inclusion team to set up a new policy or for us to move forward in our hiring. But how are people showing up with their teams? How are they influencing? How is the individual manager influencing their unique decisions? And really that question of how we put powerful people analytics into the hands of the learner to help them change behavior is what we've worked on in my world at Tribe. And so I won't go into too much on this but really the question is, could we think about simplifying the amazing knowledge that we now have from the world of people analytics in terms of data on people's behavior and learning to help nudge them on the right behavior to take next and what they could work on? And so really that has been the work that we've been on for the last couple of years. And there's a ton that we've learned about what makes the kind of data that we show most powerful. And you see three things up there on the screen. We've been challenged to make it as simple as possible for the learner, as social as possible in connecting them to other people in the ecosystem, and as deeply personal as possible about what they are individually working on. And kind of what you get is a really simple tool, though, that gamifies the kind of behavior change that you're looking for. So let's get this really real and make it an example and get out of the world of the theoretic. Say we recognize that around diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we're really asking for our people managers to start running more inclusive meetings, paying attention to who may not be speaking and making sure there's room for them, no matter the background. The way that we would put analytics into the hand of the leader is simply first by just prompting them to start tracking their own data around, did they notice who was being listened to and who wasn't? Did they notice anyone's contribution who was being overlooked? Could they take a moment to actively champion and support where it was needed? And then by collecting that data, we then start nudging them on at the right moments, the right time to do that, right? Or not to, and how they're doing. And then by gamifying it, which once again is like really, really simple, for the 80% of people who desire to make progress on this, but might not move, but just might not be reminded or motivated in the moment, we're able to get them to move. And we've seen some pretty incredible things in terms of impact. Using this people analytics in the hand of the learner approach, we see 80% of our learners report behavior change in just 2 weeks. And on one hand, that sounds kind of crazy when you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, given how little progress that we've made. But when you really think about it, the thing I often tell people is if I got you to focus on anything 4 times a week for the next month, you would have to work really hard to not get better at that thing. That's the power of your personal tutor. With people analytics, we can simply nudge them at the right moment and keep them engaged long enough to get that behavior change. But one of the things that I just want to call out here is that what we've experienced in trying to influence diversity, equity, and inclusion through leadership and learning and development is that it does call for a new kind of learning that can support a new kind of analytics. In many ways, we realize that this is a place where the data and the technology is way ahead of our models. Most of the ways that we approach learning today, particularly when it comes to soft skills or things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, don't actually assume behavior change in mind. There are these huge knowledge dumps of throwing information at people, basically hoping to create awareness and then see what happens. And so one of the things that we have been wrestling with quite a bit is what does it actually look to design learning that has behavior change in mind? Not just knowledge acquisition. And there are lots of things. This is just a journey that we're in the beginning on, but I just want to share with this group 3 things that have stood out as you do that. I think the first is that when learning isn't just about awareness, but behavior change, it has to capture both hearts and minds, so we speak. That's a fun way of saying it's both the science and the emotional connection, because that is how we as humans change. And so what's the personal reason for them paying attention, and what's a simple framework for them to do it? The second is that if learning is really around behavior change, it needs to be social. Humans are social animals, and we learn and model our behaviors after one another. Making sure that in the classroom, learners are actually actively connecting with each other and learning from each other versus from the person at the front is really important. And the third piece, which you've probably heard time and time again, is just about making it deeply, deeply actionable and getting people to commit to real actions that they plan to take like right after. Just kind of want to close on that. I think that DEI right now, in particular, how we create behavior change within our organizations for diversity, equity, and inclusion is both our big challenge and our big opportunity. The stakes are high. I only need to look at what is being brought to, I think, newfound attention for some of us this year on issues of race, of issues of gender inequity as we think about the impact of COVID on working mothers versus other people, but on a whole slew of ways in which our world is not as equitable as we would like. And it can be overwhelming. But I think at the same time, the potential for impact is huge. And I think that really for us is the opportunity, and I'll skip ahead just so that we can make sure that we get some good time to engage Al. But before we kind of close, I want to share some common pitfalls to avoid as you and your organizations go on your own diversity, equity, and inclusion journey from the work that we've seen, whether you're leveraging leadership development or some other means. The first mistake is perfection over progress. This work is so important, and sometimes being really well-meaning, we stop and kind of want to spend as much time as we can getting things perfect, and so we never actually get moving. The challenge I want to leave with all of us is what we are talking about is too important for us not to make progress on. And quite frankly, if anyone had the perfect answer, we would have solved the issue now. So no one does. So be what one mentor I love calls perfectly imperfect, and don't use that as an excuse not to get moving. The second is to look. The second mistake is looking at intent over impact. When we do get moving with the best of intentions, we will make mistakes. And when those mistakes get called out, it is really easy and quite frankly human to get defensive. But ultimately, and this is, I think, a place where the world of analytics has been extremely powerful for us, if we remain laser focused on the impact that we want to have, then we avoid the endless conversations around who was right or who was wrong, and instead are working together towards whether we get there. And the last piece is moving away from a targeting versus universalism dichotomy to a world of targeted universalism. I'll take a moment because some of these terms might not be familiar to everyone on. So the targeting versus universalism debate is basically, wait, should we go and target minorities as we desire to support them? Or should we create policies where everybody wins? And you often find that debate kind of getting everyone stuck as we move forward. I want to posit a different approach, which is targeted universalism, which basically says there is a common standard that we want everyone to get to, a standard of the experience of working that, quite frankly, no one has. And yet the needs of different groups in order to meet those are different. And so we will be targeted in our methodology or approaches in order to getting to that universal moment. And so just finally in closing, my hope is just that I think we in the world of people analytics have a responsibility to make sure that we're using our work as agents for good. There is so many powerful examples, and hopefully I didn't have time to share all of them, but depending on the time, Al, we can look through a couple of examples. But there is so much good that can be done. And it's the people on this call who are listening who are really in the driver's seat of what we do in them. And with that, it's just there's a need for heart as well as mind to guide our work. We all love geeking over this stuff, but it is incredibly influential. And the choices we make around what we build, what we buy, and the way that we execute as people in people analytics, and whether or not we consider questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion are going to define what our world looks like as a generation. So I want to close on a practical note and leave you with the questions I think that you could ask yourself in order to make sure that you are taking one step literally next week to do some good with people analytics. So on the question of diversity and inclusion, whose perspective is missing in and on the data that you are collecting? What would it look like for you to go after getting it? On the question of equity, how could you use the insights to give greater access to opportunity within and beyond your organization? And on the question of belonging, how could you use the data to foster stronger, not weaker relationships across your org? Al, I'd love your reactions. What of what I said resonated well with you, and what do you have questions on or even disagree with?
Well, disagree? No. I wouldn't, I'm not going to argue or anything like that. Quite the contrary. I want to just celebrate what you bring to the table. And I'm not doing that just because I'm in that mood or because of who you are. I just want to just say that this ultimately, this challenge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, I put it as a challenge intentionally, is it takes proactive engagement. It's not something that's just going to come because we wish it to. You mentioned at the outset that all this money that's gone into this, and it's kind of like checking boxes and going back to normal. It's just, I've been really taken by my own experience in the wake of, not in the wake, in the midst of Black Lives Matter, in the midst of, this call for social justice, that, even talking with our kids, it's, we have to get out there. We have to do something. It's not going to come to our doorstep. It's going to be us wanting to make a change individually, and it's going to want us as leaders, whether it be in people analytics, HR, or business, to do something different. And so I just want to get your comments on that notion that we have to proactively engage and not just wait.
Yeah. I could not agree more. And one of the kind of metaphors that comes to mind is that if you don't feel yourself fighting against the tide, you are not swimming upstream. And the truth is, the tide is not moving towards equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so if you don't feel the strain of your movement against it, if you don't feel the wrestling that you are doing within yourself and as an organization, then you're very likely floating where the river is going. And that is to a place of lack of equity. That is to a place of more homogeneity. And that is, quite frankly, to a place of oppression, not intentional oppression, but to a place where people do not get an equal shot at success. And this is deeply personal to me because I can see the difference, Al, between the lives that we lead today and the world as we know it and the world that I grew up in. And I am very well aware that nobody has to do anything different to keep that level of inequity existing in the world. But in order to create any kind of change there, it takes energy. And the reality, and not just energy, but time. And I think that was the other wisdom in what you were saying. That, I think part of the reason that we have been having the same conversation for 20 years, and I talked about that, is the fact that I don't think we've been quite scientific about where we're trying to go and how do we do it. But the other part is that the work that we are trying to do is not work that you're going to achieve in a week or a month or even a year. And the challenge for us to fight the good fight, so to speak, to keep going past the headlines, as I've sometimes said, past like when it is really where we go. And connecting it to our conversation, this audience today, one of the best ways to do that, and I always say, does actually come from what we measure, right? Because the moment we actually have real metrics around success, well, then we're not relying on the energy of the day. And I really feel, and I think your last speaker was saying about like, this is our one moment. And he was talking about in terms of people analytics. I feel in the same way this around the role of analytics in DEI. This is our one moment. There is attention on this. It is on everyone's top of mind, but it won't be a year from now. I mean, I hope it is. I hope I'm proven wrong here. But like history would tell me it isn't. But if the right people have really thought hard about how we think about measuring success and what we hold ourselves accountable to, that is what is going to carry us on for the distance that we need.
Yeah. And it's going to be the case where it's going to take some discomfort, to your point. It's going to be swimming against the tide, and complicity is going to perpetuate, if not exacerbate, the norms that have then been generated over history, and that's not good. And so if we do want to change, then we're going to have to create that change. We have to be the change. Where did I hear that before? Be the change. Somebody said that. But anyway, Thomas, again, any final closing comments as we start to wrap?
Maybe my thought is, going back to my list of progress over perfection would be the positive way that I would say it. This is a big issue. There are a lot of ways to get started, but please do get started. My challenge would be for everyone on this call, no matter how small. And if you need any advice on what that might look like for you, you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn. I will more than happily suggest something. But our biggest challenge is not who's going to figure out the big right answer, but that enough people just care about this enough to get moving in some direction. And so please do.
Yeah. All right. Well, Thomas, love it. Love your message. Love who you are. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting, and look forward to seeing you again very soon, sir. Be well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me, Al.